Okay, so there are some advantages to leaf shutters that we don't have access to because we're using SLR cameras. One of the advantages is faster sync speed with flash. We're going to talk later about when you're using a flash, it's important that the flash and the shutter go off at the same time. We call that being in sync. One of the things that's nice about a leaf shutter is that you can use faster shutter speeds with the flash. Whereas an SLR camera using a focal point shutter, the sync has to be a little bit slower. But for the most part, again, we're going to use focal plane shutters. So again, this is what a focal plane shutter looks like. It looks a little bit like blinds on your windows that you would open and close. A leaf shutter looks different. A leaf shutter, if you're looking through the lens, a leaf shutter looks like these blades that kind of spiral open and then spiral close. Again, the cameras that we use don't typically use leaf shutters. We're using focal plane shutters. So now, what is the point of a shutter? Well, the whole reason that shutters were invented was because the recording mediums, film, were getting more and more sensitive. When cameras were first made, there was no need for a shutter. Think about cameras in the 1850s, right? A photographer, they'd have this big box camera that would be sitting up on a tripod. They'd have this big sheet off the back of it. And then what they would do is, before they put the film in, they would open up the back of the camera so they could look through the camera. And then they would take the lens cap off the front of the camera. That would allow light to come through. And then what they could do is they could reach around and they could focus the lens. And then before they took the photo, what they do is they put the cap back on the front of the camera. Then while they were under the blanket, then they would insert the film in the dark. That's why that big blanket was there, so you do it in the dark. They'd insert the film. Then they'd come out from underneath the blanket. They haven't taken the picture yet. Then when they're ready to take the photo, what they would do is they would reach around, they would grab the lens cap on the front of the camera, they would take the lens cap off. That would allow light to come in and hit the film. And then what they do is they would just count. Because typically to take a photo would take about 30 seconds to a minute. So they'd count 1001, 1002, 1003, and then after 30 seconds they'd put the lens cap back on. Then they would get back underneath their blanket, they would pull the film out, then they would take it to a darkroom where it would be processed. Now, the exposure times, and by the way, the definition of exposure time, let's write that in your notes. Exposure time is the actual length of time that the recording medium is being exposed to light. That's what we call exposure time. The amount of time, usually in seconds or fractions of a second. Exposure time is the amount of time that the recording medium is being hit with light or exposed to light. And again, going back to that example of taking photos in 1850, you would take the lens cap off the front of the camera, light would pour through the camera, and it would expose that film for 30 seconds or a minute. And so there was not really a need to have a really precise way of controlling exposure time because the exposure times were really long. I can take the lens cap off, count to 30, put it back on. Think about the earliest photographs, though. The earliest photographs were not taken of people that were alive. And the reason for that is a live, living, breathing person cannot hold perfectly still for 30 seconds. So the earliest photographs of people were all of dead people. Or they were of landscapes, mountains and trees, because those things don't move. It wasn't until the films got more sensitive, meaning that they would respond to light quicker, that they could then start taking photographs with shorter exposure times, ones around 1 or 2 seconds. In which case, now you can start taking pictures of people, because people, for the most part, can hold fairly still for 2 seconds. You know what's hard to hold still, though, is your smile, because your muscles kind of twitch a little bit. So in the earliest photographs of people, living, breathing people, all the people in those photographs would be stern-faced. They wouldn't be allowed to smile because it would ruin the photograph. Eventually, though, it got to the point where the films got so sensitive that you started taking pictures where the exposure times were now less than a second. So think about trying to take the lens cap off, put it back on in less than a second. It would be pretty tough to do it accurately. So they needed to invent a way to control exposure. And so now we got the invention of what was called the shutter. And the first shutters were not inside the camera. They actually would attach to the front of the lens. The very first shutters were what we call drop shutters, or the slang term they used to use for them is they were called guillotine shutters because they looked like little guillotines that would kind of close off, like a guillotine that would chop your head off. And so they were an accessory. They weren't part of the camera. They were an accessory that you would purchase and put on the front of your lens. Nowadays, the shutters are built into the cameras. Because nowadays, when we take photos, our exposure times are not normally 30 seconds long or even 2 seconds long. Most of our exposure times are less than a second. They're fractions of a second. Right? The shutters that we have in our cameras, focal plane shutters and leaf shutters, we can control how long that shutter opens and closes. We can control it down to 1,000th or 2,000th of a second. That's really fast, right? So we can manipulate what is referred to as the shutter speed. So how do shutters control exposure? They do this by controlling how long it's open and therefore controlling the amount of light that exposes the film. That's how shutters work. Right? An analogy for exposure to help you remember kind of how exposure works. Think about your recording medium, and let's talk about film for now. Think about film being like a cup that you're going to fill up with water. And if you're going to take a good picture that's not too bright or too dark, you need just the right amount of light. So think about light like water coming out of a faucet. And if film is like a cup that you're going to fill up, right? If you go to fill up that cup, so let's say I'm really thirsty, I want to fill up a cup. If I open up the faucet and allow the water to flow and begin to fill up my cup, what happens if I open up my faucet, really thirsty, go to get a drink, I open up the faucet and I close it down too quick? That's right, not very much water is going to come out, right? My cup is only just partially full. So when I go to get a drink, I'm not quenched. I didn't get enough. I wanted a full glass of water to quench my thirst. So if I open and close it too quickly, not enough water comes out. If we're using this analogy to exposure in cameras, if you go to take a photo and you open your shutter up and you close it off too quick, not enough light gets through to fill the film up with light. You need just the right amount of light. All right. Inversely, what happens if I open up the faucet and I leave it open too long? Now it overflows, makes a big mess, right? I need just the right amount. And one of the ways that we control that is by how long do we leave the shutter open? If we open and close it too quick, not enough light, our picture is too dark. What's the term we use? We don't call it too dark, we use underexposed. Inversely, if I open it up too long, too much light, it is overexposed. Meaning it's going to look what? Too bright, too bright. I need just the right amount. So I need to adjust it depending upon the lighting situation, right? Understand the analogy? Make sense? Okay. Shutter speeds. Look at that film camera that I've had you have on your desk there. I have this Nikon FM10 here. On top of film cameras, like the one you have, like the one I have here, there's a dial on top of the camera. And it's pictured here. This is a Nikon FM10. And on top of that camera, there is a dial that has some numbers on it. This dial is called the shutter speed dial. And those numbers that you see are shutter speeds. 1, 2, 4, 8, 15, 30, 60. These numbers are what we call the shutter speed full stops. Full stops. Pardon? Nope. F is for aperture. We're talking about shutters now. So these are not f-stops, these are shutter speeds. These are the shutter speed full stops. I expect that for the midterm, you will have these memorized. All right? These are standard for almost all cameras. Doesn't matter if it's a Canon, Kodak, Nikon, Pentax, whatever. These are standard shutter speeds. I expect that you will have them memorized, the numbers from 1 to 2,000. And they're not hard to memorize, by the way. Because if you notice, they basically double. Right? So if we were to list them, and let's list them together. You can put them in your notes, I'll write them on the board. Where's my marker go? There it is. So if we were to list them from 1 to 2,000, we start with 1. If you double it, we get 2. The next one doubled is 4. The next one doubled is 8. Now here's where it's somewhat tricky. Technically 8 doubled is 16, but if you look at your shutter speed dial there and the one on your camera, it goes from 8 to 15 instead of 8 to 16. From 15 it goes to 30. 30 doubled is 60, and then here's the other tricky part. Technically 60 doubled would be 120, but here we see it goes to 125. Then we go to 250, 500, 1,000, all the way down to 2,000. These are what we call the shutter speed full stops. What we're going to see in a moment when we look at our digital camera, though, is between each one of those, there are actually other settings, what we call half stops. I'm going to define what I mean by full stops and half stops a little bit later. But for now, these are what we call the shutter speed full stops. These are what we refer to as shutter speeds. So I'm just going to put SS as an abbreviation, shutter speeds. Yep, so far so good? Now, the question becomes, if I use a shutter speed of 30, how does that affect how long the shutter is open? Remember I said before that we have something called exposure time. Exposure time is actually how long the shutter is open. So for example, if I went to take a photo and I pushed the button and my shutter opened, and then as it opened I were to start a stopwatch, for example. So I push the button to take a photo, the shutter opens, I start the stopwatch, and then as soon as it closes, I stop the stopwatch, and if I looked at that time, that would be exposure time. So far, so good? So how does this number, which is the shutter speed, correlate with how long the shutter's open, which we call exposure time? So I'm going to write over here, exposure time. We're going to take a look at that. Everybody grab that film camera, that Pentax camera there. And on top of the camera, there's that shutter speed dial. So on top of the camera, there's this dial. Notice the shutter speeds we've listed there are on there. You should see that one of the shutter speeds is 1. Please turn the dial to the shutter speed of 1. Go ahead and reset your shutter by moving the armature. Go ahead and open up the back of your camera like we did before. Okay? And what I want you to do, and everybody look at me for just a moment, I want you to turn the camera towards turn the shutter, the back of the camera towards yourself, and then go ahead and push the shutter release button and set the shutter up. All right? So you've got the back of the camera open, set the shutter off, and you're going to see the shutter's going to open, it's going to stay open, and then it's going to close off. All right? Do that a couple of times real quick. Again, you've got the shutter set at 1. Set it off once or twice. Now what I want you to do is, I want you to set it off again, but before you do that, I want you to imagine you've got a stopwatch and you're timing it. And in your own mind, I want you to figure out how long you think it's actually open in seconds. Do that now if you would. So if you're using a shutter speed of 1, how long would you say the exposure time is in seconds? 1, 2. It's actually 1. And the reason is sometimes we have a tendency to not realize how long a second actually is. Right? Think about when it's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's actually 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, or 1,001, 1,002, 1,000. A second's actually a fairly long time. And so actually, when you have the shutter open, if you were to actually take a stopwatch and time it, a shutter speed of 1 results in an exposure time of 1 second. Or another way we can think about this is 1 over 1 seconds, which is still 1 second. So far, so good? So a shutter speed of 1 results in an exposure time of 1 second. All right. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to adjust your shutter speed to 2 and repeat that process. So on your camera's shutter speed dial, set it to 2, reset the shutter, and set the shutter off this time. Again, take a look at it and try to judge how long you think the shutter's open this time. Before I ask for your number, let me ask you a question. Did the shutter open and close slower or faster? So it actually went faster. So if we're considering exposure time, did a shutter speed of 2 result in a longer or shorter exposure time? Shorter, actually. So how much shorter? How long would you say that the shutter was actually open? Again, if you were using a stopwatch and you were timing it, how long do you think it's open? It's actually 1/2 the second. So there's a relationship between shutter speed and exposure time, and it's an inverse relationship. Meaning the way you get exposure time is by putting a 1 over the shutter speed, and that'll tell you how many seconds it's actually open. So if the shutter speed is 2, the exposure time is 1 over 2 seconds, or in other words, 1/2 a second. Or if you were using decimals, it'd be 0.5 seconds. Okay, so if the logic continues, which I think it probably should, before you look, if you were to go from a shutter speed of 2 to a shutter speed of 4, do you think that the shutter will be open longer or a shorter period of time? Shorter. All right, it should move faster this time. Let's take a look. Do that now. Again, set your shutter speed at 4. Okay. Set it off. All right, set it off. So it got quicker, didn't it? So again, if we're correlating shutter speed with exposure time, the shutter speed of 4 results in an exposure time of 1 over 4 seconds, or 1/4 of a second, which is 0.25 seconds. So far, so good? So, what is going to give you more light? Using shutter speeds of 4 or shutter speeds of 1? 1. Okay, so if our logic continues, what would happen if I drop my shutter speed down to 60? 60. Are you expecting the shutter to increase in speed or decrease in speed? Increase, which means it's not going to be open very long. In fact, how long do you think it will be open? 1/60th of a second. So everybody please adjust your shutter speed on your camera to 60. And set it off. So adjust your shutter speed to 60. All right. How fast? Super fast. In fact, to the point where you're not entirely sure it's actually open. Right? If you want to see for sure if it's open, point the camera up at the light, set it off, and you actually will be able to see it is open. Yeah, you have to take the cap off. Sorry. You have to take it. You do have to take the cap off the front. My apologies. Yes, you do have to take the cap off. So if you remove the lens cap, hold it up to the light, set it off, you're going to see, actually, you can see light through there when it goes off. So how long is the shutter open when you use a shutter speed of 60? 1/60th of a second. That's not very long. How much light's going to make it through there? Not very much. Well, actually more than you think. Because remember, light travels at the speed of light, which is pretty damn fast. So even if the shutter is only open for just a fraction of a second, there's still quite a bit of light that makes it through. All right. I'll get your question in just a second, though, I promise. So then, what's going to happen if I drop my shutter speed down to 1,000? How long is the exposure time? 1,000th of a second. So 1 divided by 1,000 seconds. Or in other words, 0.001 seconds. That is lightning fast, right? In fact, set your camera at 1,000 and try it again. Look at it this time. Now, Del, you had a question?
Yep.
Yeah.
When you said 1 second, how we can see it and it opens up all the way. As the number increases, does it still open? It just opens real fast, or does it partially open?
No, it does open all the way. That's a good question. So Del's asking the question, does it only open part of the way? No, it is opening all the way. It's just opening really fast. It is still opening all the way. It's just opening and closing even faster. All right? So using a shutter speed of 1,000, are you going to get a lot of light through the camera? No, not very much, because it's opening and closing so quickly. That's like, remember using our analogy of the faucet? That's like opening and closing the faucet, like lightning fast, right? Now, what's going to happen if you open and close the faucet lightning fast? Not very much is going to come through, right? So it's quite possibly going to be what? Too dark. Again, the term is underexposed. We didn't fill our glass up all the way, right?